So we're going to move on now to the town hall session. This is the part where we need all of you to participate, so prepare yourselves. Over the last 24 hours, we've heard about a lot of the great things that are happening in the area of the environment, but I think we've also heard consistently that they aren't happening fast enough. Hal Harvey on the stage, when asked, how much time do we have, said minus 10 years. Earlier, Ma Jun said we have to bend the curve much faster than we are. So what we want to do here in this session is to get you to focus on what are the things that can be done that will accelerate progress in dealing with these global problems that we face. And we have a number of people who are going to get us started with their ideas, but we really would like to get all of you in the conversation over the course of the next hour. And so I'm going to ask our thought starters to answer this question, which is, give us one thing, the one thing that you think is most likely to accelerate progress in addressing these problems in the next few years. Now, I realize there are no silver bullets. These are complex problems, but prioritization is important. And I hope during this discussion over the next hour, we can surface some of the most important priorities that can come out of the conversations we've been having for the last 24 hours. And let me start with Asit Baswas, who is the Chief Executive of the Third World Center for Water Management. Please. You have 2 minutes, by the way, so condense your wisdom into 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. In my way of thinking, the main requirement will be how do we get our senior-most policymaker, be it the Prime Minister or the President, first get interested in the problem, understand the problem, appreciate the problem, and realize its urgency. If we can do that, that will be a big help. Let me give you just one example, very quick example. In 1965, when Singapore became independent, its Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew decided that for Singapore to survive and thrive, water is the most critical issue. And he put in his office 3 people who looked at all national policies in terms of water. If it did not satisfy, the policy did not satisfy the water quantity, quality requirements, it was out. And as a result of which, in 1965, Singapore's urban water, wastewater management was as bad as Delhi or Beijing or anywhere else. But 15 years later, Singapore's water and wastewater management became one of the best in the world, and it continues to be one of the best in the world. So we need the support and strong long-term support of the people at the top. And fortunately for Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew was Prime Minister for 25 years, and he made miraculous changes. He cleaned up the Singapore River, he cleaned up the Kallang Basin, and that has now become one of the best, most expensive real estate, the financial capital of Singapore. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So leadership at the top really matters. Mr. Tsai, where are you? Tsai Jin-young. Please.
I think the most important thing, particularly at this time of the global geopolitical tension, is really can China and US recommit to a shared future. And we are at a critical juncture. If the 2 countries can work together, because we are collectively responsible for more than 40% of the emission. And if we work together, there are a lot of solutions we can implement, execute. If we cannot, as a lot of people have been talking about decoupling, I think we are going to set back the global sustainability drive for many years. And the reason, there was a speaker talk about energy, right? China has been reducing coal consumption rapidly, and we are planning to import a lot of cleaner fuel, including the LNG from US. US is the largest producer right now. That will be a great trade for the world. But given what we are saying right now, if those trade become weaponized as a containment tool for China, China has to find a way to find a secure supply. That's for energy. For agriculture, another major sector responsible for the emission. If we are going to have a trade fight, China will not be able to buy soybeans, corn, whatever, from the established system from the US. We have to rebuild our own system. That means a lot more land and a lot more investment. So the tension on trade, and frankly, it's the containment, for a lot of people in Washington are saying, has a serious implication on the sustainability for the world.
Fascinating. So you worry that the trade war is going to have very detrimental effects on the
At this stage, when you think of, if you listen to the narrative in Washington, it's not only America trying to slow down the China, almost like trying to disrupt the supply chain, right? That's very, very detrimental. And not only US trying to do that, at least some people are saying that, and also let's build up the coalitions. Let's build up the allies. That's almost a strategy to contain China. Look, I think China will find a way to survive.
Yeah.
Actually, will do well. But the implication on the sustainability issue will be profound in the future.
Yeah. So we have leadership at the top. We have U.S.-China relations. I want all of you to be thinking about this because I'd like to get as many of the people in the audience in this conversation during the hour as we possibly can. So think about what you think the issues are that we're missing. But next, let me go to Hal Harvey.
Thank you, Alan. And first, let me stipulate that I agree with the previous two spokesfolks. But I'm going to try something different. I think every person should commit for 1 week to ride with a child a bicycle to the child's school and back. Why?
Yes, why?
Because first of all, you would quickly discover whether your city was built for cars or built for people. I mean, about 1 in 10 Chinese have a car, and yet cities are totally jammed with traffic and horns honking and so forth, right? So we're disenfranchising everybody that doesn't have a car for the few that do have a car. Second, you're going to have a very clear experience of whether your air quality is clean or not, right? If you're breathing hard for a little bit. Third, it's good for your health. And fourth, you're investing in a future generation. You're spending the week with your kids. And so if you care about the form of cities and transportation, if you care about air quality, if you care about the future or health, it's going to be visceral. And that's what makes people act, is when it's personal.
So get on a bike, ride to school with your kids.
Yep.
All right.
Somebody else's kids if you need to borrow them.
Christiana, where are you? Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I fully subscribe with the previous views. Political leadership from the top, it's key. I think the change that we need to see has to be at the whole systems level, and therefore, I think given the very short time that we have, we need to identify almost like the acupuncture points in this system that if we push on them, we can get a rapid and quick transformation. And I refer to the finance, which is the bloodline of the entire economies, but most importantly to the subsidies. So if I can pick on one thing, I think we need to look at the harmful subsidies that are destroying nature. OECD reports indicate about $100 billion going in subsidies that destroy biodiversity per year. Energy subsidies, $260 billion. So right now our economic and governance system is designed to harm nature, to harm the planetary systems. We need to revert that. How do you do that? With political will, with the engagement of the entire government, not just Minister of Environment, with the Minister of Planning. He had a fantastic talk with the Ministers of Economy and Finance. And finally, of course, the citizens. Not only the bike, but how about reducing your meat consumptions? How about looking at what's in your plate and try to maybe not eat strawberries in January in Chicago if they're imported from Kenya, and think about the CO2 emissions of that transfer, and many, many other reasons. But I think we have little time, and we need everybody to sort of aggressively campaigning for education and for changing the mindset on this. Thank you. It wasn't many.
Yeah, there was a lot there, but the main focus is focus on subsidies. Stop subsidizing the wrong stuff and subsidize the right stuff.
Correct.
Tanaka-san.
Thank you.
Thank you. My recommendation is that we have to focus more to the demand side. I have a kind of bias in the supply side as a former government official and IEA executive director. We always think about the supply side, which technologies, which resources provide us energy. But what could change this framework is a demand. Because now there are many companies who are claiming themselves renewable energy 100%, RE100 companies. Apple, Walmart, GM, BMW, Sony, Fujitsu, these companies are going to commit only renewable energy in the years to come. And they are asking exactly the same thing for their suppliers. So wherever they are, in China, in Japan, in Europe, in the United States, they have to only use renewables. Who is going to buy the electricity generated by coal then? So investing in coal doesn't make sense. So financial institutions are more focused on the risk of climate. TCFD is exactly that. There are 170 Japanese companies now signed up to TCFD. That's the largest volume of companies in the world to move that direction. So they are changing, not the government, not the leader, because ambition level is always low. Unfortunately, that is the history shows. So demand side driven change or transformation is what we need to see, and actually that is happening.
Great, thank you, Tanaka-san. Who else has suggestions here? We have the importance of leadership at the top. We have the importance of US-China cooperation. We have the suggestion that we all need to go out there and experience our environment a little bit more. Subsidies matter, and focus on the demand side, because the demand side can force change. Right back here, please. Can we get a microphone back there?
Thank you. Klaus Kunz from Bayer. A very pragmatic and simple proposal is that the companies put sustainability performance and financial performance at the same top priority level in terms of funding, in terms of reporting, and also in terms of incentivization.
You put environmental performance at the same level as financial performance?
No, sustainability performance, which includes environmental performance, at the same level like financial performance.
The problem is, if you don't have financial performance, the company's not going to be able to do the rest.
I don't say financial performance goes away. I just say sustainability goes on the same level.
Put it at the same level for the company. Who else has a suggestion? I know this is something all of you have thought about. Yes. Right here. Thank you.
Hello, Cameron Clayton with IBM. I think it's about public-private partnerships. We need to share the data. There's still so much debate about which is the right facts, as opposed to sharing transparently data between the private sector and the public sector. I think that'll get us to better solutions much more rapidly.
Cameron, can you give an example of the kind of data sharing you're talking about?
I can give you an example of it working very well in the weather space, right? With climate change, with governments all around the world. With the Indian government recently just opened up all of their data to us as a private sector company to help, be a megaphone for the Indian government to protect their people from flooding. Took less than a year, 1 billion people impacted.
Yeah. Christian, can we bring a microphone up here, please? And then back there. All right, let's let her go first since she has the mic, and then we'll come to you, Christian. Go ahead.
My name is Aditi Mukherjee, and I'm a researcher with the International Water Management Institute, and I'm also an IPCC scientist involved in the current IPCC report. So I wanted to talk about two things. For one is this entire idea that we can have limitless growth in a situation where you have limits, you have physical limits to how much you can grow. So I think that changing that growth mindset is something that's very important. The other thing I wanted to talk about, the issue of equity and fairness and justice, I think that doesn't get enough discussed, and that's going to be very important in the context of climate change, because as we all know, there are certain vulnerable people who are going to be affected more than others.
Can you just elaborate briefly on what you mean by changing the growth mindset?
I think by what I mean is that our natural resources are not infinite, and this entire model that we can grow infinitely, that, you know, the kind of lifestyle that many in the West have is something that can be replicated in, say, India or China. We have to really rethink those. And I think there's also, it wouldn't make me very popular saying it here, but there's a large literature coming around degrowth, which says that there are other metrics of measuring a society's happiness and well-being, and that's not necessarily linked with GDP growth per se, but what do you find meaning in life and, you know, other things.
Great,
yeah.
thank you. Christian.
Christian Rønning-Tønnesen from Statkraft in Norway. 3/4 of all climate emissions comes from energy across all sectors, buildings, transport, and so on. So in order to address this, two things are needed. One is to electrify as much as possible and to produce that electricity with renewable sources. Since it was already proposed to go for more renewables, I would add we should electrify as much as possible in all sectors. And let me add, China can have a pivotal role in doing this, being a world leader in electric vehicles, two-wheelers and buses, and also China can lead the way in renewable energy, the two of the most important, even if there are difficulties towards the US.
And if you focus on that, if you focus on electrification and then making sure that the generation of power is clean, how much of the problem have you dealt with?
If we can do this combination, we are addressing 3/4 of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. David.
Yeah, David Rosenberg with Aero Farms. Put a price on carbon. So surprised it hasn't been said yet. And for that matter, put a price on all sorts of pollution. The externalities that the markets don't calculate, bring them in.
I have to feel, David, like we've been talking about putting a price on carbon for a decade and don't seem to be getting there. What will it take to actually unlock that and make it happen?
So that's a whole other issue. But one way is to go where there's high political will or high pain and start in those places. And even though the market dynamics suggest those areas are at a competitive disadvantage, where there's high pain, or high political will, that's one way, a beachhead, if you will, to start and then expand.
Yep. Thank you. Deborah. Can we get a microphone to Deborah, please?
Thanks. I think that we have a chance to embed something like water risk into sovereign risk ratings for countries, because we're not cutting down carbon enough, and we're going to feel our impacts in terms of climate and also water risks. These are no doubt going to impact our balance sheets and also our P&L. And also credit rating agencies have agreed that this would impact credit ratings, except how do we calculate this? So I think if we can throw our lending behind this in calculating that, and you can sort of say governments can no longer borrow at that rating, then you may be pushed to decarbonize faster.
So the importance there is metrics, being able to measure water risk in a way that it goes into financial calculations.
Yeah, because right now TCFD is great, but TCFD is focused on carbon, right?
Yeah.
And actually, it's you heard Yin Hung on stage just now. Most of the risk that manifests in terms of impact on lending is in water, is in the form of water.
Good. What else? What are we missing here? Yes, right here.
你好，我呢
Let me give my comments in Chinese. I can give you an example. China is working on waste sorting and is formulating policies on that. Well, waste sorting is related to the biodiversity as well as the biosecurity. Well, this sorting policy is government-led. But we have to talk about how waste is generated. Waste is the terminal product of the production of human beings. But we have organic and non-organic wastes. For the organic waste, which can be naturally degraded and cannot, make a secondary pollution. But for some other waste, if not naturally degraded, such as the plastic, cannot be naturally degraded and will pose a lot of pollution and threat. waste cannot be something that make a government in the opposite position of the consumers. We have to think something, for the manufacturers. We have to make them aware that the waste can be recycled, and what materials composes the waste, and how to deal with and dispose the waste. All these have to be informed of for these manufacturers, not just simply categorize the waste into dry waste or wet waste. In that way, from the manufacturing part to the consumption part, we're going to have a lot of opportunities. And again, we need to set some standards on that. Thank you.
Standards for waste. Yes, sir, right here. Can we bring a microphone up here, please?
We've been talking about waste. I think most importantly, we've got to reduce consumption or usage. If we continue using concrete to build houses, and they can be used only for 50 years, and the entire world will be filled with concrete. Well, for plastics, we can advocate wood-based or paper-based or glass-based packages and bottling. But the most important thing for us to do is to reduce consumption or the usage of the materials, or by replacing concrete with steel in building materials or stainless steel. Let's use more durable materials. I think that lady has asked a very good question. As developed economies, and China is about to become one of them, is there an upper limit of growth? If mankind and all the economies are pursuing quarter-over-quarter and year-on-year growth all the time, there will be no future for our planet. And the population keeps growing, and the material consumption by individuals keeps growing. There will be no future, no equality for the planet, for the future. The vulnerable will become even more vulnerable.
Radical thought. Question here. Two questions here, and then here and here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Jack Hurd. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I feel as though we have flirted with the issue of putting a value on our natural systems. And we've tried it in various places. Yes, we haven't been successful at the role that, say, forests play in carbon. But I think we intrinsically build in values of the natural systems in many of the decisions we make, but we don't actually incorporate them into national accounts. We don't take them into consideration when it comes to land use planning decisions. We rarely look at them in performance management around individual projects. A greater effort going forward in integrating the valuation of services or of natural systems and bringing that into decision-making processes is going to help us address some of the climate issues that are of concern, and specifically the biodiversity conservation issues. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. More on metrics. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm Pamela Marr. I'm with the Fung Group in Hong Kong. Our big issue is consumption. So from a consumer products perspective, we see the rising 2.5 billion new consumers in Asia from now until 2035 is a really good thing. But from the world's perspective, it's not. So I think we should be using every single resource that we have to help Asia create the new paradigm for sustainable, inclusive consumption. It's possible. We need political will, and we need the governments to actually get the companies to clean up their supply chains and clean up consumption in Asia. This is a chance, because we're now at the point at which Asia's forming policy, developing its governance institutions to make the transition from primary to secondary to tertiary.
But you talk about political will. It's hard, isn't it, to say to the new arrivals, no, you can't do what everyone who came, the billions who came before you did.
It's not about saying, no, you can't do it. It's about getting every company in Asia to clean up what they're doing and to put long-term profit ahead of short-term.
Yeah, good. There were a couple of questions right in here. You've got, let's do this and then that.
Greg Steele from Arcadis. I really like Earth scientists Edward O. Wilson's hypothesis and modelling that shows if we set half the world aside as being wild and protected, this has enormous positive impacts on biodiversity and climate change and starts to reverse. It forces us then to be much more efficient in how we live in cities and that half the world, the land and the sea being wild.
So protect more land. Right here, please.
OK， 大家好，我叫塔塔。
My name is Tata. I'm an education worker or professional. We would like to find the shortest cut to all the problems we're facing. But I have a question for you. If we keep evolving mankind, will we still face the same issues if we have good enough evolution of mankind ourselves? I think all the issues associated with education and healthcare, the two mega issues. And we have had many discussions, but not deep enough, not fundamental enough. We are always looking at things instead of people. As an educational professional, what seems to be the longest path might prove the shortest one, but the capitalists, the investors, do not want to invest enough in education. That's status quo. Let me say a few words about trade between China and the United States. Let me give you an example. We know the famous novel, The Pilgrimage to the West, or The Journey to the West. The monk Tang and his disciples have different objectives. They have different objectives, but the pilgrimage to the West has aligned their diverging objectives. Ultimately, they succeeded in their mission. Yeah, the same will take place between China and the United States. It's possible for our two countries. We should sit down while lowering our respective expectations to achieve a cooperative paradigm, like a journey to the West or a pilgrimage to the West. And fighting evils, all those devils during the journey will be the common cause and the shared impetus behind us, giving us more opportunities for collaboration. Thank you.
I like that. I like the focus on people more than goods. Who else? Yes, right here, please.
Thank you. Cecilia Tortajada, National University of Singapore. We all say when we talk about sustainable development that we have to do things properly to protect the next generations, we assume the next generations know what to do, and they don't. While there are many young people who are more responsible, there are many who are not. We know of all these kids that go to all these big concerts that have for a common good, with a good objective, and at the end they drop the tents. They leave enormous amounts of solid waste. And also the evidence indicates that if they do one activity that is greener, they won't do the same if it is not convenient. So I think it's time to start engaging younger people so that the effort of all the present generations, when we pass them, they are also fructiferous.
Fascinating. Thank you. Peter, can I put you on the spot? Sure. What do you think the most important thing we can be doing is?
Peter Groupstein with NGen. I'd actually follow up with what Jack Hurd was saying and David Rosenberg, which is we somehow need to add into the Accounting Standards Board the actual cost of ownership of an asset or what we're depriving people of as an asset. I'm not sure how to quite do that, but I think it'd be really important, rather than a carbon tax, to recognize that the plastic that we heard about that's being emulsified, we really need to, that bottle that cost 1/10 of a cent really costs $4. Yeah. But more importantly, we also need to include it in our healthcare costs. Yeah. And so 1/3 of our healthcare at least could be cut if we had a better environment and better food.
Yep, more comprehensive metrics. Saswato, please.
Yeah, Saswato Das with IBM. I'd like to follow on that note, saying that we should add a cost to forests, because deforestation is a real issue, and growing biofuels doesn't really compensate. So metrics for forests as assets.
Yep, thank you. Over here.
I'm Priscilla Liu, DWS Sustainable Investments. One of the things that I would really like to see is for large public listed companies to not only focus on P&L, but really P&L with respect to overall resource consumption and depletion. And so if they have to account for, which going back to what Peter and what Dave was talking about, and also sustainability being as important as a financial performance, is that if we can include in that really accounting for how much water you're depleting, how much waste you're producing, how much waste you actually recycle, and therefore offset the waste that you actually dispose without recycling, and how much water you consume without reusing gray water and so on. If all of that becomes a part of your performance, because resource, we talk about capital return and capital performance, but capital can be more than just money. It should be resource overall of the environment. And I think that should be the focus of all the corporation.
Yeah, and more and more companies are doing that, but the problem of consistent, reliable metrics is yeah. Was there something you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to finish a little bit of what you were saying or talking about, which is you want to avoid it being a tax. Somehow it's got to be put together more as an incentive to do that, and that's where I'm still struggling. But we've been.
How you do that?
How do you actually do that as an incentive? Because you can't make the McDonald's hamburger an $8 hamburger because the healthcare costs are so high and the packaging costs are so high, but because you're penalizing the poor, or it's regressive, I should say.
Yeah, you could go back to Tanaka-san's point that demand could be what forces companies to adopt new metrics. Who else? There was a question over here. Comment?
Hi, Linda from Dow. Just commenting on the conversations I've heard these 2 days, I think it's just a reminder that the treating of a waste issue is not a sequential or mono-solution one, in the sense that yes, we talk about what's a new material to replace plastics and so on. And sure, that's definitely a worthwhile thing to look at, but it feels as if that it's replacing one material for another if you don't look at the rest of the cycle. So while we are looking for more solutions, if monopolymer recycle-ready materials are not satisfactory, then don't dismiss recycling, because it is stopping waste leakage into the oceans.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. What are we missing here? Yes, you have another thought, and then right here.
One more idea linked to the political leadership. Why not make environmental performance metrics a voting issue? When you're voted in office or out of office, generally people look like how much growth you generated, how many jobs. Make that an environmental performance issue as well. Take stock when you're coming into office, what's the quality of the environment, and report back when you seek re-election, and make it a democratic vote issue.
Interesting.
As well.
Thank you. Yes, Sai-san.
I think there are a lot of ideas generated. Yeah. And I think the fundamental focus of this forum and beyond, really we want to achieve results, really look at what are the priorities. There are 1,000 ideas you can execute. I think this country is very interesting, has one fundamental issue. You got to provide the right incentive to do all the things and above. Some of them is, you can design the incentive easier, and others more difficult. So what I want to say is we need to focus on our solutions, so to speak, on what we call the market system. What has been driving the global growth and lifting 100 million people from poverty is really the market system. Market system is still the system, for us, the fundamental tool to deal with sustainability. And there are certain areas that we market failure, and there are others, actually a lot of more areas if we put our heads together. And when you have the market incentive designed well, and you can achieve a much better result rather than, everyone has a little idea. Some people say we don't eat meat, but I will tell you, as the income level going up, people want to eat meat because more nutrients are actually a lot of good benefits.
Yeah.
So that's really, I think, I hope through this forum we can kind of focus on what are the market incentives we can design.
Yeah, I like that focus, and I think a number of the comments we've heard over the last hour have been aligned with that. How do we get a price on carbon? How do we get the right metrics so the market knows the cost that it's reacting to? I think those things are all right in line. Jeff?
Yeah, I want to just focus on something that's been bubbling up here that I think is fascinating, and maybe test that with those of you in the room. And that is, I think Tanaka-san put his finger on this specifically, and that is the notion of a shift from a supply side problem to a demand side problem, not just in energy, but in the whole economy. We had a conversation this morning in a session in which some people were suggesting that we, the world, are at a moment where there is emerging a demand, a consumer demand for the sorts of things that everyone in this room is talking about that didn't exist a few years ago. And a lot of the discussion in here is about how do the people at the top structure new incentives, new mandates to push people. And the notion that's emerging is actually that there is starting to be a pull, starting to be a consumer pull. And I'm interested to test that. Do you all buy that? Do you all think that that pull is happening? Or is that just so much wishful thinking by kind of people in this room who are...
And ultimately the issue is not just do they want it, but are they willing to pay for it or do something inconvenient in order to achieve it? Yes, right back here, please.
Well, just a follow-up, I think, old generation like me call it education, but I've kind of picked up a term this morning from the youth that they call conscious construction, which I think should be like a transparency. Before I joined this industry, I may not know much, but more I join the industry, I know much more, then would affect my behavior. If we can have a structure, transparency or collaborative structures transparency, which is very credible, and we would able to create some movement, which I think collectively we can do something.
Thank you. Peter, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I have spent the last 10 years building brands, and I unfortunately do not feel that there's demand for this enough to make a difference. I do think mandates are really much, much more important. And the analogy I'd give is what we call the Nike effect. And you see it when you walk into a Whole Foods, where the average person's wearing a pair of Nike shoes, or maybe not the average, they're probably not at 50%, but they're wearing Nike shoes, they're substantially overweight, and they're going in to feel that they're being healthy. Because A, they're wearing the shoes, now they're going into a Whole Foods store, and what are they buying? They're buying fried chicken and macaroni and cheese. They are not buying what's healthy, and they're not doing what's healthy. So I think the only way you can get people to do what you're asking to do is you've got to provide a mandate for it. So
well, you're saying the market won't solve the problem?
The market's not going to solve the problem until you at least put a couple of barriers there that make it easier to solve the problem.
Do you want to take issue with him, Sai-san, before? Oh, yeah, go ahead, and then we'll give it back.
Well, going back to the question that you pointed out earlier is how do you address the issue of tax, and now with respect to mandates. I think it requires both mandate, the push and the pull, push from the top in terms of policy and the pull from the demand consumers. And I still go back to that when you are required to show how much plastic is in your products, and that's part of your disclosure, given one one company versus another, if one company is using a lot of plastics for the products, for packaging, and the others aren't, they're using paper, then I think that this millennium, the younger generation, will gravitate towards the more conscientious company. And so that in itself is a tax. In other words, the reputational risk will drive the corporations to behave properly. Yeah. And I think that that is going to be the turning point. This is why I keep going back to the fact that the disclosure shouldn't just be about money. It should be about the amount of resources you are putting back into the environment, as well as the resources you consume and deplete. Yep. And I think that's important. So that goes back to, is the pull happening? Well, the pull will happen if, in fact, the right information is disclosed, and therefore the population and the buyers and the consumers will decide.
Yeah, Mr. Tsai.
Thank you.
I think a lot of this talk about consumer, I think we live in the big city for too long. And you have to think of the world, right? 7.5 billion people, and a lot of the fastest growth of consumption really developing countries, right? And how, I mean, the income level is still very low. If you go to a dollar store, even in the US, people are looking for cheap products, right? The whole millennial, I think they're great. I think over time we'll get there. But we are solving a more urgent problem. How do we deal with that? I agree with that gentleman. You need mandate, but you have to really understand the consumer at the day is an economic animal. And they'll remember this. Your question is, are they willing to pay? I think with a good education, gradually they'll come to that point. But initially, it will take a long time to get there.
Yeah. I want to go, oh, I'm sorry, right here, go ahead.
Well, in general, the world should realize the threats posed by climate change and the threats facing biodiversity. If we can heighten the awareness to a level high enough, there will be new policies and ideas from the decision-making communities. But nobody, or very few people, have really realized how perilous our world has become. Environmentalists, NGOs, and other experts have actually not subscribed to the severity of the threat in a very genuine way. If we take a look at the growth in the amount of rubbish waste every year, is it going to fill the entire world? Or after a 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise, are we going to continue surviving or not? If there is a lot more research about it with authentic and certain answers and indicators and parameters, and if we can turn those conclusions into consensus, then there will be real changes happening.
Otherwise, other from the year 2000, i.e. in the past 20 years, we have been talking about emission reduction, but in reality, emissions have been increasing and there has been no sign of reduction. Change is therefore essential. Thank you.
Some of our fire starters here to reflect on the wide diversity of comments you've heard over the last hour. Asit Biswas, maybe you can do that first. Can we get a microphone up here?
I think many of the things we heard, it has to come again from the policies made by the policymakers. Can we go to the demand side? Well, we can go to the demand side provided the policymakers put the policies, right policies, so that instead of supply side, we go to the demand. So in my way of thinking, it has to start from the right policies. And that is the most difficult part. We can talk about equity, but then somebody said, what about eating strawberries in Boston in winter? What about the poor farmer from Nairobi? What is going to do his income if his market from US disappears? People talk about the British buying flowers from Kenya. Well, we have to think about the poor farmer in Kenya who is producing the farmer. So the problems are complex. The issues, when you look into it, they are difficult. Yeah. They're not easy.
Yeah.
All actions have beneficiaries and people who pay the cost.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we maximize the beneficiaries and how do we minimize the cost?
You need wise policies.
Yes.
Where is Lee Kuan Yew when we need him?
That is what it is. And where is Lee Kuan Yew, who could stay in politics and be elected for 25 years?
Hal, can I call on you?
Sure. So I'm going to take a departure from what I said earlier. We need to draw a few lines. Roughly half the carbon in the US, and I presume this is a reasonable fraction for the world, goes through monopoly pipes and wires, which means they're regulated. So we have standards for labor, we have standards for contract, why not standards for electricity? It's that simple. Either through compulsion or reward, it doesn't matter as long as it gets done. And the same goes with buildings. Why allow people, we don't allow people to build buildings that burn down. We don't allow people to build buildings that fall down. So why should we allow people to build buildings
that just waste energy. It makes no sense whatsoever. There's a small number of policies, about a dozen policies, that make all the difference. And I think that's what we were hearing from the crowd here. These are public standards, and they cannot be neglected or ignored or put in the back of the line compared to everything else we work about. We just have to step up to the plate with these things.
That's great. Thank you. Tanaka-san, you want to give us a last bit of wisdom?
Tanaka-san?
I don't have much wisdom because this issue is so difficult, but we have always, if the government is involved, then there are many governments together. So collective decision-making of the governments is very difficult. How to make a level playing field is always cumbersome. So that's the reason why I believe that the change, real transformation happens from bottom up. The demand side, I stress the importance of the demand side because of that. But I know that mandate or kind of decision or encouragement or incentives or good disclosure is necessary. So we discussed a lot, and I still believe that China as a major player in the renewables and energy consumption in the future. So if any change for the green economy, green transformation, it should happen from China.
Great. Anyone else? Clay, you have some final thoughts for us here? An amazingly interesting and diverse conversation across the room. Can you give the microphone to Clay? Thanks.
Well, I'll just observe quickly that I'm fascinated by Tanaka-san's comment, especially given his background. I mean, you know, the Japanese experience, especially, you know, meaty at the center of this, was about figuring out how to nudge the private sector using government levers and controls. And for someone whose whole career was kind of spent inside that machine to say really the solution is demand-driven and we have to figure that out. But it also strikes me as an irony that many of the changes in costs that are driving the demand equation from the advances in renewables in China are happening in a way because of mandates, because the government has subsidized many of these industries, solar in particular, to make this possible. So, you know, to me, it's really interesting about how you get that balance of those equations right. And I'm also struck by Mr. Tsai's comment about, you know, we can't forget that on the demand side, a lot of the consumers are quite poor and are very cost conscious. One thing that I've noticed that's quite interesting is Ant Financial, which you know, facilitates the purchases of a lot of these newly emerging people in rural areas in China, has figured out a way that very simply even poor people can say, if there's some extra spare change and I want to just round up the price of my transaction, I'm going to use that to purchase trees in China, Mongolia, you know, some of these deforested areas. And what they found was that even people that are poor, if you design a system that kind of creates the right incentives and just nudges them a little bit, are willing to do their bit to help the environment. They've actually planted millions and millions of trees and had a huge impact on deforestation in China, largely through transactions for poor people. So we haven't really kind of talked about how you figure out how to scale these things with simple nudges and tweaks, but it's an interesting thing to explore.
Incentives matter even at the smallest level. Yes.
大家好，我是来自于中。Good afternoon. I'm from China, an agency engaged in the formulation of green development policy, and I have been part of policy formulation in the past years. We have actually drawn upon experiences from many countries in the world, and we are committed to promoting green development in China in a systematic way. We have done so in 4 areas. First, in administration. Administrative effort is critical. Since the 10th 5-year plan period, in all the 5-year plans, we have targets including energy intensity, carbon emission targets. These administrative targets were also broken down into different sectors, different industries, enterprises, and localities. For example, energy users will take up their responsibility. In this regard, there are also disciplinary measures. And the second one is economic indicators. As was mentioned by some, starting from the 13th five-year plan period, we have been doing ETS pilot and also trading of energy using rate and also the transaction in pollution discharge rate, etc. China has been doing pilots in many of these. And the third one is in terms of laws and regulations. We are producing compulsory standards and criteria so as to ensure enhancement of energy efficiency and environmental protection standards, so as to ensure that we will embark on the path of green development. And the final one is the social influence, that is by extensive publicity and advocacy organized by the government, industries, as well as NGOs, so as to enhance the awareness for green development. It is our hope that these actions in synergy will conduce to green development. Thank you.
We need more five-year plans is what. Go ahead. This has to be the last comment.
Thank you, Craig Leeson, filmmaker. There's one very uncomfortable discussion I think that we're going to have. Which
you're going to end us with an uncomfortable discussion?
It is, and it's related to supply and demand, and that is by 2050 there are going to be 9.8 billion people on the planet. More people, less resources. And if you talk to Sir David Attenborough or US economist Jeffrey Sachs, they say that all the problems that we are experiencing, overfishing, climate change, deforestation, single-use plastics, come back to one thing. There are too many people and not enough resources, overpopulation. And it is an uncomfortable conversation, but it's one that we're going to have.
Thank you for that encouraging ending. And I think this is the appropriate time to make a transition from this very difficult conversation to a party. The reception will begin on the meeting room level, which is just one floor below this ballroom. At the reception, we're going to have a special performance by the Silk Road Project Symphony Orchestra from the Kunming Arts Vocational College. After the reception, we will have a spectacular dinner on the lawn. This is hosted by Hilton. It features 8 chefs and cuisines from all across China. And we will also have a special performance at dinner from the Ani ethnic group's Near Bamboo Orchestra, including a solo performance from the Mongolian horsehead fiddle. Raise your hand if you've heard the Mongolian horsehead fiddle before. There are a few. Okay. This is going to be a new experience for most of you. Tomorrow we will start at 8:30 sharp with our concurrent sessions, so be sure to be there. Thank you for this very enlightening discussion that we've had here. I'm not sure we solved the problems, but I feel like we're making progress in the right direction. Thank you very much.